The elevator lurched to a stop between floors 14 and 15, and Marcus Chen thought his worst day just got infinitely worse. He was already running late for the custody hearing that would determine whether he'd see his daughter Emma more than every other weekend. But when he heard the woman beside him gasp and whisper, "No, not now, please not now," he realized that sometimes the universe has different plans entirely. What happened in that small, stalled space would change everything. He thought he knew about second chances, forgiveness, and the mysterious ways broken hearts find their way back to wholeness. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights in the downtown Chicago office building flickered against the November rain streaking the lobby windows. Marcus Chen adjusted the collar of his only good suit, the navy one he'd worn to his wedding 8 years ago, the one that now hung loose around his shoulders from months of forgetting to eat regular meals. His reflection in the polished marble wall showed a man who looked older than his 34 years, with worry lines etched deep around dark eyes that once sparkled with the kind of optimism that made people want to follow him anywhere. He clutched a manila folder containing documents that felt heavier than they should. Character references from his boss at the construction company where he worked as a foreman. Bank statements showing he'd been making his child support payments on time every month for the past year. Photos of the small 2-bedroom apartment he'd rented in a good school district, with Emma's room painted purple because she'd mentioned once that it was her favorite color, though he wasn't even sure if that was still true. Kids changed so fast, and he'd missed so much. The elevator dinged softly as it arrived at the lobby level. Marcus stepped inside and pressed the button for the 23rd floor, where Hartwell, Morrison Associates had their family law offices. His lawyer, Janet Morrison, had warned him that today wouldn't be easy. His ex-wife Sarah had remarried 6 months ago to a successful investment banker named Richard Holloway, and they were arguing that Emma would be better off with more stability, a proper 2-parent home, and fewer disruptions to her routine. They wanted to reduce Marcus's visitation to once a month, supervised visits only. The elevator began its ascent, and Marcus closed his eyes, trying to center himself the way his therapist Dr. Martinez had taught him. Breathe in for 4 counts. Hold for 4. Breathe out for 6. He'd been working on managing his anxiety ever since the divorce, when panic attacks had become as regular as his morning coffee. The therapy was expensive, another line item in his budget that left little room for anything else, but it was helping, slowly. The elevator stopped at the 7th floor, and a woman stepped in. Marcus glanced up briefly, then did a double take. That made his heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with anxiety and everything to do with recognition. Even with her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, even with the oversized sunglasses hiding her eyes, even with the way she carried herself differently now, more carefully, more guarded, he knew exactly who she was. Dr. Elizabeth Reeves, the emergency room physician who had saved his daughter's life 3 years ago. She was visibly pregnant, probably around 7 or 8 months, and she moved with the careful precision of someone carrying precious cargo. She wore a charcoal gray dress that probably cost more than Marcus made in a week, and diamond earrings that caught the elevator's harsh lighting. Her left hand bore a wedding ring set that looked like it belonged in a jewelry store window. Everything about her screamed success, wealth, the kind of life that existed in a completely different universe from his. She pressed the button for the 15th floor and took a position near the back corner of the elevator, as far from Marcus as the small space would allow. He wasn't even sure she'd noticed him. Why would she? He'd been just another worried parent in a waiting room full of worried parents that night 3 years ago. But he remembered every detail about her. Emma had been running a fever of 104 degrees that wouldn't break. Sarah had been out of town on a business trip, and Marcus had been alone with their 5-year-old daughter, watching helplessly as she became more and more lethargic. He'd called the pediatrician's emergency line, but when Emma started having trouble breathing, panic had taken over. He'd scooped her up and driven to Northwestern Memorial's emergency room, running red lights and praying to a God he wasn't sure he believed in anymore. Dr. Reeves had been the attending physician that night. She'd taken one look at Emma and immediately ordered a battery of tests. Meningitis, she'd explained calmly to Marcus while nurses worked around them with efficient urgency. They'd caught it early, she'd said, but another hour or two of delay could have been catastrophic. She'd stayed with Emma personally through the first critical hours, even though her shift had ended. Marcus remembered sitting in that uncomfortable plastic chair, watching this composed, brilliant woman save his daughter's life with a combination of medical expertise and genuine compassion that had left him in awe. Emma had recovered completely, though the experience had marked the beginning of the end of Marcus's marriage. Sarah had blamed him for not recognizing the symptoms sooner, for not calling an ambulance instead of driving, for 100 small decisions that she claimed showed he wasn't responsible enough to be trusted with their daughter's safety. The guilt had eaten away at him for months, even though Dr. Reeves had assured him that he'd done everything right, that his quick thinking had probably saved Emma's life. Now 3 years later, here she was, standing 6 feet away from him. In an elevator, the universe had a twisted sense of humor. The elevator climbed steadily past the 8th floor, 9th, 10th. Marcus tried not to stare, but he couldn't help stealing glances at her reflection in the polished steel doors. She looked tired, he realized. Despite the expensive clothes and perfect makeup, there were shadows under her eyes and a tension in her shoulders that reminded him of how he'd looked in mirrors during the worst days of his divorce. They passed the 11th floor, and Marcus felt his phone buzz. A text from Janet Morrison, running a few minutes behind. Don't let them intimidate you. You're a good father. He appreciated the reassurance, but it didn't do much to calm the storm in his stomach. In less than 10 minutes, he'd be sitting across from Sarah and Richard and their lawyer, arguing for the right to remain a meaningful part of his daughter's life. The elevator reached the 12th floor, and that's when everything changed. The lights flickered once, twice, then the elevator shuddered to a stop with a mechanical groan that seemed to echo through the walls. The display panel went dark for a moment, then flickered back to life, showing they were stuck between the 14th and 15th floors. Marcus felt his chest tighten immediately. Enclosed spaces had been a trigger for his panic attacks ever since the divorce. Something about feeling trapped that sent his nervous system into overdrive. Dr. Reeves looked up from her phone for the first time since entering the elevator. Even with the sunglasses on, Marcus could see concern cross her features. She pressed the emergency call button, and they waited for a response. Hello? A crackling voice came through the intercom. This is building maintenance. We're stuck between 14 and 15, Dr. Reeves said, her voice calm and professional. How long until you can get us moving? Working at it now, ma'am. Looks like we've got a power issue on that bank of elevators. Should have you moving in about 30 to 40 minutes. 40 minutes. Marcus felt sweat begin to bead on his forehead. He had 15 minutes to get to his appointment, and Janet had warned him that being late would not make a good impression on the judge. He pulled out his phone to call her, but there was no signal. No cell service, Dr. Reeves observed, checking her own phone. She removed her sunglasses, and Marcus found himself looking into the same intelligent green eyes he remembered from that night in the hospital. Are you claustrophobic? She asked, and there was genuine concern in her voice. Marcus tried to control his breathing, but the familiar tightness was already building in his chest. A little, he managed. And I have a custody hearing in 15 minutes on the 23rd floor. She studied his face, and he could see the exact moment recognition dawned. Her expression shifted from polite stranger to something more complex, more personal. You're Emma's father, she said softly. It wasn't a question. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus nodded, surprised that she remembered. You saved her life 3 years ago. Meningitis. A small smile crossed her face, the first genuine expression he'd seen from her. She was a fighter. How is she doing now? She's wonderful, Marcus sighed, and despite everything, his voice filled with pride. She's 8 now, loves soccer and art class, and asks about 1,000,000 questions every day. He paused, then added quietly, though I don't get to see her as much as I'd like. That's what today's hearing is about. Dr. Reeves was quiet for a moment, and Marcus could see her processing this information. I'm sorry, she said finally. Custody battles are difficult. There was something in her tone that suggested she spoke from experience. But before Marcus could respond, she suddenly gasped and doubled over slightly. One hand pressed to her lower back, the other bracing against the elevator wall. Are you okay? Marcus asked immediately, his own anxiety forgotten. She breathed heavily for a few seconds, then slowly straightened up. I'm fine, she said, but her voice was tight with pain. Just false labor. I've been having Braxton Hicks contractions for weeks. Marcus didn't know much about pregnancy, but he knew enough to recognize when someone was trying to convince themselves as much as him. Are you sure? Maybe we should try to get help faster. Dr. Reeves shook her head firmly. I'm not due for another 6 weeks. It's just stress contractions. She pressed the emergency button again. Hello, we need to expedite this. I'm a physician and I'm pregnant. Copy that, ma'am. We're working as fast as we can. Fire department is on their way as a precaution. Another contraction hit her, stronger this time, and she couldn't completely hide the pain that crossed her face. Marcus had seen enough construction accidents to recognize when someone was putting on a brave front. Dr. Reeves, he said gently, with all due respect, you delivered my daughter safely through a medical crisis. Let me help you through this one. She looked at him sharply, and for a moment he thought she might argue. But then another wave of pain hit, and something in her composure cracked just slightly. Elizabeth, she said quietly. My name is Elizabeth. Marcus, he replied. And I think we both know these aren't false labor pains. Elizabeth closed her eyes and leaned back against the elevator wall. They're coming every few minutes now, she admitted, but it's too early. The babies aren't supposed to come yet. Babies? Marcus felt his eyes widen. Twins? She nodded, and he could see fear flickering behind her professional calm. Boys, they're healthy, but premature birth can still be dangerous. She took a shaky breath. My husband is in London on business. I was just at my OB appointment when the contractions started getting regular, but Dr. Patterson said it was probably nothing and sent me home to rest. Marcus looked around the small elevator space, trying to think practically. His construction experience had taught him to assess situations quickly and work with whatever resources were available. The elevator was clean and relatively spacious. The emergency lighting was adequate, but they were stuck between floors with no immediate way out, and Elizabeth was clearly in active labor, whether it was supposed to happen or not. Okay, he said, pulling off his suit jacket. I'm not a doctor, but I've been through 1 labor and delivery, and I've seen enough medical emergencies on construction sites to know the basics. What do you need me to do? Elizabeth stared at him for a long moment, and he could see her warring between her medical training and her human vulnerability. Another contraction answered the question for her, stronger and longer than the previous ones. She gripped the handrail and breathed through it, with the focused intensity of someone who understood exactly what was happening to her body. The contractions are 3 minutes apart, she said when it passed. That means we're probably looking at active labor progressing quickly. She managed a wry smile. Premature twins apparently don't like to wait around. Marcus felt his phone buzz and managed to get 1 bar of signal for just a moment. A text from Janet. Where are you? They're asking about rescheduling. He stared at the message, then at Elizabeth, who was breathing through another contraction. The custody hearing that had seemed like the most important thing in the world 10 minutes ago suddenly felt very far away. He typed back quickly, "Emergency, we'll explain later. Please reschedule." Then he put the phone away and focused entirely on the woman who had once saved his daughter and now needed his help. "Tell me what to do," he said simply. Elizabeth looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I can't ask you to do this," she said quietly. "You don't know me. You have your own crisis to deal with." Marcus thought about Emma, about that night in the emergency room when this woman had dropped everything to save his child's life. He thought about the custody hearing upstairs, about Sarah and Richard and their lawyer who were probably sitting in a conference room wondering where he was. He thought about all the ways his life had fallen apart over the past few years, all the chances he'd missed, all the times he'd let fear make his decisions for him. "Dr. Reeves." "Elizabeth," he said firmly. 3 years ago, you stayed past the end of your shift to make sure my daughter was going to be okay. You didn't know me then either, but you saw a parent who needed help, and you helped. Now I see someone who needs help, and I'm not going anywhere." She studied his face for a long moment, and he saw something shift in her expression. Trust, maybe, or just a recognition that she didn't have a choice. "All right," she said, and her voice had taken on the crisp, professional tone he remembered. "From the hospital. But I need you to listen carefully and do exactly what I say. Premature twin delivery is complicated even under the best circumstances, and these are definitely not the best circumstances." Marcus nodded, feeling his anxiety transform into something more useful. Focus. This was a problem that needed solving, and he'd always been good at solving problems. Elizabeth started giving him instructions, her medical training taking over even as her body prepared to deliver 2 babies 6 weeks early in a stalled elevator. She told him about the emergency supplies they might need, about the importance of keeping the babies warm, about what signs to watch for that could indicate serious complications. Marcus listened intently, filing away every detail the way he would memorize blueprints for a complex construction project. As she talked, he found himself studying her face, trying to reconcile the composed, wealthy woman who had entered the elevator with the vulnerable, frightened mother she was revealing herself to be. The expensive clothes and jewelry told one story, but her eyes told another. There was pain there, and not just from the contractions. A loneliness that seemed familiar to him, the kind that came from carrying too much by yourself for too long. "Marcus," she said during a break between contractions, "I need to tell you something before this goes any further." She hesitated, then continued. "The reason I remember you and Emma so clearly, that night in the AO changed something for me too. I'd been thinking about having children, but I wasn't sure I was ready. Seeing how much you loved her, how terrified you were at the thought of losing her, it made me realize that kind of love might be worth the risk." She gestured to her pregnant belly. "These boys, they were very much wanted, but their father—" She trailed off, pain flickering across her features. "Let's just say that wanting children and being ready to be a parent aren't always the same thing." Marcus felt a familiar ache in his chest, the one that came whenever he thought about all the ways love could go wrong, all the ways people could let each other down, even when they meant well. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I know something about that." Elizabeth nodded, as if she'd suspected as much. "The custody hearing," she said. "Your ex-wife thinks you're not a good father?" Marcus laughed bitterly. "She thinks I'm irresponsible, unreliable, that Emma would be better off with her new stepfather who can provide stability and resources I can't match." He ran a hand through his hair. "Maybe she's right. I work construction, I live paycheck to paycheck, and I have panic attacks in elevators. Not exactly Father of the Year material." "But you're here," Elizabeth said simply. When your daughter needed you that night, you brought her to the hospital. When I need help now, you're not walking away. That sounds like someone who shows up when it matters." Before Marcus could respond, another contraction hit Elizabeth, stronger than any of the previous ones. She gripped his arm instinctively, and he could feel the tremor of pain that ran through her body. "They're getting closer," she said when. It passed, and for the first time, he heard real fear in her voice. "Marcus, I need you to call the emergency number again. Tell them we need paramedics now, not in 30 minutes. These babies are coming whether we're ready or not." Marcus pressed the emergency button repeatedly, but got only static in response. He tried his phone again, but still no signal. They were truly on their own, suspended between floors in a downtown Chicago office building, with Elizabeth about to give birth to premature twins. "It's going to be okay," he told her, with more confidence than he felt. "We're going to figure this out." Elizabeth managed a small smile. "You know, most people would be panicking right about now." Marcus considered this. "Maybe I should be. But honestly, this is the most useful I've felt in months. At least now I have something real to focus on instead of just worrying about everything I can't control." Another contraction hit, and this time Elizabeth couldn't stay standing. Marcus helped her sit down on the elevator floor, using his suit jacket as a cushion behind her back. As he did, he noticed something that made his breath catch. Around her neck, barely visible beneath her dress collar, was a small silver pendant, a guardian angel. He'd seen one just like it before, in the hospital gift shop 3 years ago. He'd bought one for Emma after she recovered, wanting her to have a reminder that angels came in all forms, including emergency room doctors who stayed late to save little girls' lives. "Elizabeth," he said softly, "that necklace." She looked down and seemed surprised to see it visible. "Oh, that. A patient's father gave it to me a few years ago. A little girl with meningitis." She touched it gently. "He left it at the nurse's station with a note saying I was his daughter's guardian angel. I don't usually wear jewelry from patients, but..." She shrugged. "Something about that case stayed with me." Marcus stared at her, feeling the strange symmetry of the moment wash over him. "That was me," he said quietly. "I left that for you." Elizabeth's eyes widened, and for a moment, the pain in her face was replaced by wonder. "You? But why?" "Because you saved her life," Marcus said simply. "And because that night, watching you work, seeing how much you cared about a child you'd never met before, it restored something in me that I thought was gone forever. Faith. Maybe, in people, in goodness, in the idea that strangers can become angels when someone needs them most." Tears formed in Elizabeth's eyes, and she reached for his hand. "I never knew," she whispered. "I never knew it meant so much to you." "It meant everything," Marcus said. "And now, 3 years later, here we are. Maybe it's my turn to be someone's guardian angel." Another contraction seized Elizabeth, stronger and longer than before, and Marcus could see the reality of their situation settling over both of them. This was really happening. 2 babies were about to be born in an elevator 6 weeks early, with no medical equipment and no backup plan. But as Marcus looked at Elizabeth's face, saw the determination mixed with fear in her eyes, he realized something that surprised him. He wasn't afraid, not anymore. For the first time in months, maybe years, he felt completely present, completely focused, completely sure of what he needed to do. His daughter Emma had been saved by a stranger who chose to care. Now he had the chance to be that stranger for someone else. The custody hearing upstairs had been about proving he was a good father. But maybe being a good father wasn't about having the right job or the perfect apartment, or a bank account that impressed lawyers. Maybe it was about showing up when someone needed you, about choosing to help even when it was inconvenient, or scary, or cost you something important. As Elizabeth gripped his hand through another contraction, Marcus made a choice that felt like the first truly right decision he'd made in a long time. Whatever happened next, whatever it cost him, he was going to make sure she and her babies were safe. Everything else could wait. The elevator lights flickered again, casting strange shadows on the walls. Outside, he could hear the faint sound of sirens growing closer, but he knew they might not arrive in time. It was just the two of them now, suspended between floors and between their old lives and whatever came next. Elizabeth looked up at him, her face pale but determined. "Marcus," she said quietly, "I think it's time. The first baby is coming now." And as Marcus Chen prepared to help deliver twins in a stalled elevator, he realized that sometimes the most important moments in life happen in the spaces between where you've been and where you're going, in the unexpected places where strangers become family and ordinary people discover they're capable of extraordinary things. The first contraction that signaled active labor hit Elizabeth with the force of a freight train, and Marcus watched her transform from the composed physician he'd met in the hospital years ago into a woman fighting against her own body's timeline. Her breathing became shallow and rapid, and sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool air circulating through the elevator's ventilation system. The expensive makeup she'd worn to whatever appointment had brought her here began to smudge around her eyes, revealing the exhaustion she'd been hiding behind professional composure. Marcus knelt beside her on the elevator floor, his navy suit already wrinkled and forgotten. The custody hearing that had consumed his thoughts for weeks felt like something happening in another lifetime, to another person. Right now there was only this small metal box suspended between floors, this woman who needed his help, and two babies who had decided they couldn't wait any longer to enter the world. "Talk to me," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the chaos racing through his mind. "Tell me what you're feeling, what you need." Elizabeth's medical training warred with her human vulnerability as another wave of pain crashed over her. She gripped his forearm with surprising strength, her fingernails digging into his skin through his shirt sleeve. "The contractions are 90 seconds apart now," she gasped when the pain receded enough for her to speak. That's much faster than it should be progressing. With twins, especially premature twins, labor can accelerate quickly, but this is—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Marcus could see the fear flickering behind her clinical assessment. He'd learned during Emma's crisis that doctors made the worst patients because they understood exactly how many things could go wrong. The emergency intercom crackled to life, startling them both. "Hello, this is Captain Rodriguez with Chicago Fire Department. We're in the building and working to get you out. Can you update us on your status?" Marcus reached for the call button, but Elizabeth caught his wrist. "Don't tell them about the twins yet," she whispered urgently. "If they know it's an active delivery, they might try something dangerous to get us out faster." Cutting through elevator cables, using the jaws of life. The vibrations alone could cause complications. "But they need to know what they're walking into," Marcus argued gently. "After the first baby is born safely," Elizabeth said firmly. "Promise me." Marcus looked into her eyes and saw the physician making a calculated decision to protect her patients, even though those patients were her own children. He pressed the intercom button. "This is Marcus Chen. I'm here with a pregnant woman who's experiencing some discomfort, but we're managing for now. How long until you can get us moving?" "We're looking at another 20 to 30 minutes, sir. The elevator is caught on a safety break between floors. We need to manually reset the system. Is the lady okay?" Marcus glanced at Elizabeth, who nodded despite the pain etched across her features. "She's hanging in there, but the sooner the better." "Copy that. Sit tight." As soon as Marcus released the button, Elizabeth was hit with another contraction. This one strong enough to make her cry out despite her efforts to stay quiet. Her back arched against the elevator wall, and Marcus could see her hands trembling as she fought to breathe through the pain. "Elizabeth," he said softly, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder, "I need you to listen to me for a second. I know you're scared. I know this isn't how you planned this to happen. But 3 years ago, I watched you save my daughter's life, and I've never forgotten how calm you were, how capable. That same person is still inside you right now, even if she's scared." She opened her eyes and looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since the elevator had stopped. "I'm not supposed to be doing this alone," she whispered. "My husband, he was supposed to be here for this. We had a birth plan, a hospital room reserved, the best neonatal team in the city on standby." "Where is he?" Marcus asked gently. Elizabeth's face crumpled slightly. "London. He's a corporate lawyer, and there was some merger that couldn't wait. I told him it would be fine, that the babies weren't due for 6 more weeks." Her voice became bitter. "He said he'd be back in time, that I was worrying over nothing. He said work was important too." Marcus felt a familiar anger rise in his chest, the same fury he'd experienced during his own divorce when he'd realized that Sarah valued her career advancement more than their family stability. But he pushed it down, focusing on Elizabeth's immediate needs rather than his own emotional triggers. "His loss," Marcus said firmly. "These boys are going to have an incredible birth story, and he's going to miss it because he thought of business. Meeting was more important than being here for his wife and children." Another contraction seized Elizabeth before she could respond, and this time Marcus could see her entire abdomen tighten and shift. The babies were definitely coming, whether they had medical equipment or not, whether they were in a sterile delivery room or a stalled elevator. "I need to examine you," Elizabeth said when the contraction passed, her voice taking on the crisp, professional tone he remembered from the hospital. "I need to know how dilated I am, how much time we have." Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks. I don't think I'm qualified for that." "You're the only one here," Elizabeth said with a weak smile, "and I can walk you through it. I've delivered dozens of babies, Marcus. I know what needs to happen. I just can't do it myself." She began giving him instructions, clinical and precise, her medical training overriding her modesty and his embarrassment. Marcus followed her directions carefully, his construction worker's hand surprisingly gentle as he helped assess her condition. What he discovered made his stomach drop. 8 centimeters, Elizabeth confirmed when he told her what he'd felt. "Full dilation is 10 centimeters. We're looking at maybe 30 minutes, possibly less." "And the fire department said 20 to 30 minutes, Marcus calculated grimly. "Which means we're probably doing this here," Elizabeth said, and he could see her shifting into full physician mode. "Marcus, I need you to listen very carefully. Twin deliveries can be complicated even under perfect conditions. The second baby is at higher risk for cord compression, breech presentation, or getting stuck after the first baby is born." Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. This wasn't just about helping someone in distress anymore. He was about to become responsible for 3 lives, including 2 babies who were arriving 6 weeks before their bodies were fully ready for the world outside the womb. "What do I need to know?" he asked simply. Elizabeth began explaining the process, her voice steady despite the pain he could see building in her face as another contraction approached. She told him about the importance of supporting the babies. Head as it crowned, about clearing the airway immediately, about the umbilical cord and when to clamp it. She explained about the brief window between the first and second birth, how the second baby might need to be turned if it wasn't in the right position. "The most important thing," she emphasized, "is keeping them warm. Premature babies can't regulate their body temperature effectively. They'll need skin-to-skin contact immediately, and we'll need to wrap them in whatever we can find." Marcus looked around the elevator, taking inventory of their limited resources. His suit jacket, already serving as a cushion behind Elizabeth's back. Her own blazer, which he could use as a blanket. The emergency lighting was adequate, but not ideal. The space was clean, but not sterile. They had no medical instruments, no clamps for umbilical cords, no suction device to clear airways. "We'll figure it out," he said with more confidence then. He felt, people have been having babies without hospitals for thousands of years. Not usually premature twins in elevators, Elizabeth pointed out, but there was a hint of humor in her voice despite the circumstances. The next contraction hit harder than any previous one, and Elizabeth couldn't suppress a low moan that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest. Marcus watched her face contort with pain and made a decision that surprised him. He moved behind her, letting her lean back against his chest, his arms supporting her from behind. "What are you doing?" she gasped. "My ex-wife said I was useless during her labor with Emma," Marcus said quietly. "But I remember this being the only position that helped with her back pain." Elizabeth relaxed against him slightly, and Marcus could feel some of the tension leave her body. "That's actually perfect," she admitted. "The pressure on my lower back was getting unbearable." They stayed that way through the next several contractions, Marcus providing physical support while Elizabeth focused on her breathing and medical preparations. In the intimate quiet between waves of pain, they began to talk about their children, their fears, their hopes for the future. "Emma is 8 now," Marcus found himself saying during one calm moment. "She wants to be a veterinarian. Or maybe an astronaut, or possibly both. She says there might be animals in space that need doctors." Elizabeth laughed softly. "That's brilliant logic. What does she think about the custody situation?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "She doesn't really understand why Mommy and Daddy can't live in the same house anymore. Sarah tells her it's because Daddy needs to grow up and learn to be more responsible. I tell her it's because sometimes adults make mistakes and have to figure out how to fix them." "And what do you tell yourself?" Elizabeth asked gently. "That I'm probably failing her," Marcus admitted. "That maybe Sarah is right, maybe Emma would be better off with a stepfather who can take her on vacations to Europe and pay for private school and never has panic attacks in public places." Elizabeth shifted against him, turning slightly so she could see his face. "Marcus, the night you brought Emma to the hospital, I watched you for hours. You never left her side, not even when I assured you she was going to be fine. You asked intelligent questions, you followed every instruction perfectly, and you advocated for her when you thought the pain medication wasn't working effectively." She paused as another contraction built, breathing through it before continuing. "But more than that, I saw how she looked at you. Even when she was sick and scared, her face would light up every time you spoke to her. That little girl adored you, and more importantly, she trusted you completely. That's not something you can buy with private school tuition." Marcus felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen. "Thank you for saying that. I'm not saying it to be nice," Elizabeth said firmly. "I'm saying it because it's true. And because I've seen enough families in crisis to know the difference between a parent who shows up and one who just provides financial support." The emergency intercom crackled again. "Mr. Chen, this is Captain Rodriguez. We've made some progress, but we're running into some complications with the elevator safety systems. Can you give us another status update?" Marcus looked at Elizabeth, who was in the grip of another powerful contraction. When it passed, she was breathing heavily, and he could see sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool air. "Captain, we're going to need medical support up here as soon as possible," Marcus said into the intercom. "The situation has escalated. What kind of medical support, sir?" Elizabeth grabbed Marcus's arm and shook her head emphatically, but he could see the fear in her eyes had intensified. The contractions were coming every 60 seconds now, lasting longer and hitting harder. "Just get us out of here as fast as safely possible," Marcus said finally. "Copy that. We're working as fast as we can." "Marcus," Elizabeth gasped as the intercom went silent. I think the first baby is crowning. I can feel the head." Marcus's construction experience had prepared him for high-pressure situations, for making split-second decisions. When people's safety was on the line, But nothing had prepared him for this. He was about to help deliver a premature baby in an elevator, with no medical training beyond basic first aid and whatever instructions Elizabeth could give him between contractions. "Okay," he said, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. "Tell me what to do." Elizabeth guided him through the process with remarkable composure, her medical expertise overriding her personal fear. She explained how to support the baby's head as it emerged, how to check for the umbilical cord around the neck, how to clear the mouth and nose of fluid. Marcus listened intently, his hands steady despite the enormity of what they were about to attempt. The next contraction brought the baby's head fully into view, and Marcus felt his breath catch. He was looking at a tiny, perfect human being, covered in fluid but unmistakably alive and fighting to enter the world. "The cord," Elizabeth panted. "Check for the cord around the neck." Marcus's fingers, surprisingly gentle for their size, carefully felt around the baby's neck. "It's clear," he reported. "Good. On the next contraction, support the head and let the shoulders deliver naturally. Don't pull, just guide." The contraction came with tremendous force, and suddenly Marcus was holding a tiny, slippery baby boy in his hands. The infant was smaller than Emma had been at birth, his skin slightly blue from the premature delivery, but his lungs were strong enough to produce a weak but unmistakable cry. "He's beautiful," Marcus whispered, overcome by the miracle he was witnessing. "Skin to skin," Elizabeth gasped. "Put him on my chest, skin to skin. Cover him with whatever you can find." Marcus carefully placed the tiny boy on Elizabeth's chest and covered them both with his suit jacket. The baby's cries grew stronger, a sound that filled the small elevator space with the most profound sense of life and hope Marcus had ever experienced. "The second baby," Elizabeth said, her voice tired but determined. "We probably have 10 to 15 minutes before he comes." But even as she said it, Marcus could see her face change, her eyes widening with surprise and concern. "What is it?" he asked immediately. "Another contraction already," she said with disbelief. That's much faster than it should be." The second baby was not going to wait the typical interval between twin deliveries. He was coming now, ready or not, and Marcus realized their brief moment of celebration was about to become an even more intense medical emergency. "Elizabeth," he said quietly, "tell me what's different about delivering the second twin." She looked at him with eyes that held both gratitude and terror. "Everything," she whispered. "Everything is different, and everything is more dangerous." As the next contraction built to its peak, Marcus found himself saying a prayer to whatever forces in the universe had brought them together in this moment. He was about to help bring a second life into the world, and he was determined not to let Elizabeth or her babies down. The first baby boy continued to cry softly against his mother's chest, his tiny fists waving in the air as if announcing his successful arrival. But Marcus knew their ordeal was far from over. The most dangerous part of twin delivery was often the second baby, and they were about to find out just how much courage and luck they both possessed. "Here he comes," Elizabeth sighed, her voice a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "Marcus, no matter what happens next, I need you to know that what you're doing, this is heroic. These boys are going to owe their lives to a man who chose to help a stranger." Marcus looked down at her, this woman who had saved his daughter and was now trusting him with her own children, and felt something shift inside him that had nothing to do with the confined space or the medical emergency. It had to do with purpose, with the realization that sometimes the most important moments in life happen when you stop running from responsibility and start embracing it. "We're going to get through this," he told her firmly. "All 4 of us." And as the second contraction began to build toward its peak, Marcus Chen prepared to once again catch a life in his hands, knowing that whatever happened in the next few minutes would change everything he thought he knew about courage, about fatherhood, and about the extraordinary things ordinary people could accomplish when someone needed them most. The elevator lights flickered overhead, casting dancing shadows on the walls as two lives hung in the balance, and a man who had spent months questioning his worth as a father discovered he had everything it took to bring new life safely into the world. The second baby was not cooperating. Elizabeth's face went pale as she felt the contraction building, her medical knowledge becoming both a blessing and a curse as she realized what was happening inside her body. The infant wasn't positioned correctly, and with each wave of her uterus trying to push him out, he was becoming more distressed. "Marcus," she said, her voice tight with controlled panic. "Something's wrong. I can feel it. He's not in the right position. He might be breech or transverse, or—" She gripped his arm as another contraction hit, stronger than any before. "If he's stuck, we could lose him." Marcus felt his heart rate spike, but his hands remained steady. 3 years of therapy had taught him to channel anxiety into action rather than paralysis. "What do I need to do?" "You need to reach inside and feel how he's positioned," Elizabeth said, her physician training overriding any sense of personal boundaries. "If his feet are coming first instead of his head, that's breech. If you feel his side or back, that's transverse. Either way, we're in trouble without surgical intervention." Marcus took a deep breath and followed her instructions, his construction worker hands surprisingly gentle as he became her eyes and instruments in a situation where precision could mean the difference between life and death. What he felt made his stomach clench with fear. I think I'm feeling feet," he said quietly. Elizabeth closed her eyes, and for a moment, her professional composure cracked completely. "Breech," she whispered. "A premature breech delivery in an elevator, with no medical equipment." She opened her eyes and looked at Marcus with an expression that was part terror, part determination. "This is how babies die, Marcus. This is exactly how we lose them." "No," Marcus said firmly, surprising himself with the authority in his voice. "That's not happening. Not today. Not on my watch. Tell me how to turn him." Elizabeth stared at him for a long moment, and Marcus could see her weighing their options. Outside intervention versus attempting something dangerous themselves. Waiting for help that might come too late versus taking action that could make things worse. "There's a procedure," she said finally. "External cephalic version. It's when we manually turn the baby from outside the abdomen, but it's risky, especially with premature babies. The umbilical cord can wrap around the neck, the placenta can detach, but it's possible," Marcus interrupted. "It's possible," Elizabeth admitted. "But Marcus, if we try this and something goes wrong, these babies could die because I was too proud or too scared to wait for proper medical help." Marcus looked down at the tiny boy already born, now resting peacefully on Elizabeth's chest, his breathing steady and his color improving. Then he looked at Elizabeth's face, saw the anguish of a mother torn between medical caution and maternal instinct. "Elizabeth," he said quietly, "when you were treating Emma, did you follow every protocol exactly, or did you make judgment calls based on what you thought was best for your patient?" She was quiet for a moment, then gave him a rueful smile. "I broke at least 3 hospital policies that night. I gave her experimental medication that wasn't officially approved for pediatric use. I ordered tests that weren't standard protocol. I stayed with her personally instead of handing her off to the night shift. And I saved her life," Elizabeth said softly. "Then trust your judgment now," Marcus said. "Not as a doctor following protocols, but as a mother who knows her babies better than anyone else." Another contraction hit Elizabeth, and Marcus could see the baby's distress in the way her entire abdomen seemed to contract unevenly. They were running out of time to make a decision. "Okay," Elizabeth said when the contraction passed. "We try to turn him. But Marcus, I need you to understand that if this goes wrong, if we lose them because we tried instead of waiting, then we'll live with that," Marcus said simply. "But if we don't try and we lose them anyway, we'll live with that too. At least this way, We're fighting for them." Elizabeth nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "I need you to place your hands on my abdomen right here." She guided his hands to specific positions on her belly. "When I tell you, you're going to apply gentle but firm pressure and try to encourage him to rotate. I'll guide you through it." The next few minutes were the most intense of Marcus's life. With Elizabeth coaching him through each movement, he carefully manipulated the baby's position from outside her abdomen, feeling the tiny body gradually shift and turn in response to his pressure. It was delicate work, requiring strength but also incredible gentleness, like trying to solve a puzzle where the pieces were made of spun glass. I think he's moving," Elizabeth gasped during a brief respite between contractions. "Try a little more pressure on the left side." Marcus adjusted his technique, and suddenly he felt something shift dramatically under his palms. "Did you feel that?" "Yes." Elizabeth's face lit up with relief. He turned. "Marcus, you did it." He's head down now. But their celebration was short-lived. The next contraction came with overwhelming force, and Marcus could see the second baby's head beginning to crown. Unlike his brother, this little one was coming fast and hard, as if making up for the delay caused by his null position. "Here, he?" "Comies," Elizabeth panted. "Same technique as before, but be ready. Sometimes the second baby comes much faster." She was right. Within moments, Marcus found himself catching his second tiny human being of the day. This one even smaller than his brother, but with lungs that announced his arrival with impressive volume. The baby boy was covered in fluid, his skin pale and slightly blue from the premature delivery, but his cries were strong and indignant. "Two beautiful boys," Marcus whispered, carefully placing the second infant on Elizabeth's chest beside his brother. "They're both here, they're both breathing, they're both perfect." Elizabeth burst into tears, clutching both babies against her chest as emotions she'd been holding back for hours finally overwhelmed her. Marcus quickly covered all three of them with whatever clothing he could find, creating a warm cocoon in the cool elevator air. "They're so small," Elizabeth sobbed, but there was joy mixed with her fear. 6 weeks early and so small, but they're here. They're really here. Marcus sat back on his heels, looking at the woman and two babies he'd just helped bring safely into the world, and felt something profound settle in his chest. Not pride exactly, though there was some of that. Not relief, though he certainly felt that too. It was something deeper, something that had to do with purpose and connection, and the realization that he was capable of far more than he'd ever believed. The emergency intercom crackled to life again, startling all of them. "Mr. Chen, this is Captain Rodriguez. We've got the elevator system reset, and we should have you moving within the next 5 minutes. How are you folks doing up there?" Marcus looked at Elizabeth, who nodded through her tears. "Captain," Marcus said into the intercom, "we're going to need immediate medical transport to the nearest hospital with a NICU. We have 2 premature babies who were just born and need specialized care." There was a long pause on the other end. "Did you say born? As in, delivered in the elevator?" "Yes, sir. 2 healthy baby boys, approximately 6 weeks premature. Mother is stable. Babies are breathing on their own, but they need professional medical evaluation as soon as possible." "Holy, okay, sir. We have paramedics standing by, and I'm calling for additional NICU transport now. You folks are heroes up there." Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Not heroes, Captain. Just people who did what needed doing." But as he looked at Elizabeth and her newborn sons, Marcus realized that maybe that was exactly what heroism looked like. Not grand gestures or dramatic rescues, but ordinary people choosing to show up when someone needed them, choosing to act instead of freezing, choosing to help instead of running away. "Marcus," Elizabeth said quietly, her voice hoarse from the delivery, "I need to tell you something before they get us out of here." He moved closer, concerned by the serious tone in her voice. "These boys," she continued, "they're going to grow up hearing the story of how they were born. And when they do, they're going to know that a man named Marcus Chen saved their lives and their mother's life when no one else could. They're going to know that there are people in this world who will drop everything to help a stranger, who will miss their own important appointments to make sure someone else is safe." Marcus felt his throat tighten. "Elizabeth." "No, let me finish," she said firmly. "You missed your custody hearing today. You probably cost yourself time with your daughter because you stayed here with me. That's not something I can ever repay." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the hearing that had seemed so crucial just hours ago. "You know what's funny?" he said finally. "I was terrified about that hearing because I was convinced I had to prove I was a good father. I thought I needed the right answers to their questions, the perfect responses to their concerns." He looked down at the two babies, now quiet and warm against their mother's chest. "But today, I didn't have to prove anything to anyone. I just had to be present, be useful, be the person someone needed me to be. And for the first time in months, I felt like a good father. Not because someone told me I was, but because I knew it." Elizabeth smiled through her exhaustion. "Emma is lucky to have you. And these boys are lucky to have you," Marcus replied. "Even if their father couldn't be bothered to show up for their birth." Elizabeth's face darkened slightly. That's something I'm going to have to figure out. David and we've been having problems for a while. The pregnancy was supposed to bring us closer together, but instead it just highlighted how different our priorities have become." "What do you mean?" Elizabeth adjusted her position carefully, mindful of the two tiny lives depending on her. "Warmth. He wanted children, but only if they didn't interfere with his career trajectory. He made it clear that I would be expected to handle all the child-rearing responsibilities while maintaining my own full-time medical practice. When I suggested maybe scaling back my hours at the hospital for the first year, he was furious. Sighed. We couldn't afford to lose the income from my salary." Marcus felt familiar anger rise in his chest. "But he could afford to be in London for a business meeting when you were this close to your due date?" "He said I was being dramatic about the timing," Elizabeth said bitterly. "Said first babies are always late, and even if these came early, I was a doctor and could handle anything that came up." Marcus shook his head in disbelief. "He doesn't deserve you." "Or them. Maybe not," Elizabeth agreed quietly. "But I'm not sure what that means for our future. I'm about to be a single mother of premature twins while working full-time as an ER physician. That's not exactly a recipe for success." Marcus looked at her thoughtfully. "You know, 3 years ago, I thought my world was ending because my marriage fell apart. I was convinced that Emma would be better off without me, that I was too broken to be the father she needed. But sitting here with you today, helping bring your sons into the world, I realize that being a good parent isn't about having a perfect life. It's about showing up, especially when things get difficult." The elevator suddenly lurched to life, the mechanical hum of the motor filling the small space as they finally began moving downward. Marcus could hear voices and radio chatter from below, the coordinated response of emergency personnel preparing to take over their care. "They're going to be okay," Marcus said, looking at the babies. "All 3 of you. It's going to be challenging, but you're going to be okay." Elizabeth reached out and took his hand. "Thank you, Marcus, for everything. For staying, for helping, for reminding me that there are still good people in this world." The elevator came to a stop at the lobby level, and Marcus could hear the emergency responders positioning their equipment outside the doors. In moments, their private world of crisis and triumph would be invaded by paramedics and doctors, and the controlled chaos of professional medical intervention. "Elizabeth," Marcus said quickly, "I want you to have my contact information. Not because I'm trying to complicate your life, but because these boys and we're connected now. If you ever need anything, if they ever want to hear the story of their dramatic entrance into the world from the man who caught them, I want to be available." Elizabeth squeezed his hand. "I'd like that. And Marcus? When your custody situation gets sorted out, when you're ready, I'd love to meet Emma properly. I think she'd enjoy meeting her baby brothers." The elevator doors began to slide open, revealing a crowd of paramedics, firefighters, and hospital personnel ready to take charge of the situation. Marcus helped guide the medical team as they transferred Elizabeth and the babies to waiting gurneys, watching as his makeshift delivery room was transformed into a professional medical transport. As the paramedics wheeled Elizabeth toward the waiting ambulance, she called out to him over the noise and activity, "Marcus, the hearing. You can still make it if you hurry. It's not too late." Marcus looked at his watch and realized she was right. If he caught a cab immediately, he might still make it to the rescheduled session. His lawyer had texted earlier that they'd managed to push the appointment back by 2 hours due to his emergency situation. But as he watched the ambulance doors close and the vehicle pull away, taking Elizabeth and her newborn sons toward the hospital, Marcus realized something had fundamentally changed in him. The desperate need to prove his worth as a father had been replaced by quiet confidence in who he actually was. The panic about losing time with Emma had been replaced by certainty that their relationship was strong enough to survive whatever legal obstacles they faced. He pulled out his phone and dialed his lawyer's number. "Janet, it's Marcus. I need to postpone the hearing again." "No, I'm fine, but I need to be at the hospital right now. There are some people who need me, and that's more important than any custody arrangement." As Marcus Chen walked out of the downtown office building and hailed a cab to Northwestern Memorial Hospital, he carried with him the knowledge that heroism wasn't about grand gestures or perfect timing. Sometimes it was simply about being present when someone needed you, about choosing to stay instead of run, about discovering that you were capable of far more than you'd ever imagined when the stakes were high enough and the cause was worthy enough. The custody battle would wait. His daughter would understand, because he was finally becoming the kind of father she deserved, one who showed up not just for her, but for anyone who needed him, because that was what good people did for each other. In a world that could be harsh and unpredictable but was also, occasionally, miraculous, Northwestern Memorial Hospital's neonatal intensive care unit hummed with the quiet efficiency of machines designed to sustain life at its most vulnerable stage. Marcus stood outside the viewing window, still wearing his wrinkled dress shirt and suit pants, watching 2 tiny forms in separate incubators surrounded by monitors, tubes, and the soft glow of heat lamps. Baby boy Reeves A and baby boy Reeves B, according to their temporary identification bands, though Elizabeth had whispered their chosen names to him in the ambulance, Alexander and Benjamin. The boys had been in the NICU for 6 hours now, and the medical team had pronounced their condition remarkably stable, considering their dramatic entrance into the world. Their lungs were developing well, their heart rates were strong, and their weight, while low at just over 4 pounds each, was within acceptable parameters for their gestational age. The attending neonatologist, Dr. Sarah Kim, had pulled Marcus aside earlier to tell him that his quick thinking during the delivery had likely prevented serious complications that could have resulted from the breech presentation. "You saved their lives," Dr. Kim had said simply. "Both of them. The second baby could have suffered oxygen deprivation if you hadn't helped turn him when you did, and keeping them warm with skin-to-skin contact until the paramedics arrived. That was exactly the right thing to do." Marcus had nodded politely, but the praise felt surreal. 6 hours ago, he'd been a failed husband heading to a custody hearing, convinced he was inadequate as a father. Now medical professionals were calling him a hero for delivering premature twins in an elevator. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Elizabeth was in a recovery room 2 floors down, physically exhausted but emotionally alert. The doctors wanted to keep her for observation for at least 48 hours, standard protocol after a precipitous delivery, especially with twins. Marcus had visited her briefly after the boys were settled in the NICU, and she'd looked so small in the hospital bed, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had happened and what lay ahead. "They're going to be in the NICU for at least 6 weeks, she'd told him, her voice hollow with exhaustion and worry. Premature twins, even healthy ones, need time to develop before they can come home. 6 weeks of driving here every day, 6 weeks of pump and pray, 6 weeks of hoping nothing goes wrong. You don't have to do it alone," Marcus had said gently, and she'd looked at him with eyes that held too much gratitude for comfort. Now standing in the NICU hallway, Marcus felt his phone buzzing insistently. He'd been ignoring calls and texts for hours, but the persistence suggested something urgent. He finally looked at the screen and saw 17 missed calls from Janet Morrison, his attorney, along with a string of increasingly frantic text messages. The last message, sent just 10 minutes ago, made his stomach drop. "Marcus, where are you? Judge moved the hearing to emergency session. Sarah's team is pushing for immediate custody revision, citing abandonment and unreliability. They're using your absence today as evidence you can't be trusted with Emma's welfare. I'm stalling, but you need to get here now." Marcus stared at the message, feeling the weight of consequence settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. He'd made a choice in that elevator, choosing to help Elizabeth and her babies instead of protecting his own interests, and now that choice was threatening to cost him time with his daughter. He was still processing this information when he heard footsteps behind him. Dr. Kim approached, her expression professional but kind. "Mr. Chen, I wanted to update you on the boys' condition." "How are they doing?" Marcus asked, though part of his attention was still focused on the legal crisis developing across town. "Very well, all things considered. Alexander, baby A, is already showing signs of wanting to breathe without assistance. Benjamin took a little longer to stabilize, but his numbers have been improving steadily for the past few hours." Dr. Kim paused, studying Marcus's face. "Is everything all right? You seem distracted." Marcus looked through the viewing window at the 2 tiny boys, each weighing less than a bag of sugar, fighting to grow strong enough to leave this place and go home with their mother. Then he looked at his phone, at the messages from his lawyer, telling him that his own daughter's future was being decided without him because he'd chosen to stay here. "Dr. Kim," he said finally, "those babies, they're going to be okay, aren't they? Even without me here watching over them?" She studied his face with the perceptive gaze of someone who'd seen many families navigate crisis. "Mr. Chen, those boys are getting the best medical care available. They have a strong, dedicated mother who will advocate for them every step of the way. And they have the memory of being brought into this world by someone who refused to abandon them when they needed help most." Marcus nodded slowly, understanding the gentle permission she was giving him to leave. "But," Dr. Kim continued, "they also have something else. They have a connection to you that's going to be part of their story for the rest of their lives. That means something, Mr. Chen, not just to them, but to their mother." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that whatever crisis is pulling you away right now, it doesn't erase what you did today. And if it's worth fighting for, then you should fight. Those boys will still be here when you get back." Marcus looked through the window one more time, watching the gentle rise and fall of tiny chests in their incubators, then made a decision that felt like jumping off a cliff. "Please tell Elizabeth I'll be back later tonight," he said to Dr. Kim. "And tell her that what happened today mattered. To me, to them, to everyone." 25 minutes later, Marcus burst through the doors of Hartwell, Morrison and Associates, his shirt still wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and his hands still faintly scented with hospital antiseptic. The receptionist looked up in surprise. "Mr. Chen." "They're in conference room B. Your attorney said to send you right in when you arrived. Marcus didn't bother to stop in the bathroom to try to make himself presentable. He walked directly to the conference room and opened the door to find exactly the scene he'd been dreading. His ex-wife Sarah sitting next to her new husband Richard, both impeccably dressed and radiating the kind of composed confidence that came from financial security and social position. Across from them sat their attorney, Miranda Walsh, a woman whose reputation for ruthlessness in custody cases was legendary in Chicago legal circles. At the head of the table, Judge Patricia Hoffman looked up with an expression that was equal parts relief and annoyance. "Mr. Chen," Judge Hoffman said, "we were beginning to think you weren't planning to attend your own custody hearing." Marcus took the empty chair next to Janet Morrison, who squeezed his arm supportively but shot him a look that clearly communicated they were in serious trouble. "Your Honor," Marcus began, "I apologize for my absence today. There was a medical emergency that required my immediate attention." "So we've heard," Miranda Walsh interrupted, her voice dripping with professional skepticism. "My clients are concerned, Your Honor, that this alleged emergency is simply the latest example of Mr. Chen's inability to prioritize his responsibilities as a father. This is a pattern of behavior that puts his own interests ahead of his daughter's welfare." Sarah leaned forward, her voice carefully modulated to convey hurt rather than anger. "Marcus, I know you mean well, but Emma needs stability. She needs to know that when her father commits to something, he'll follow through. Missing today's hearing to help some stranger." "She wasn't a stranger," Marcus said quietly, and something in his tone made everyone in the room stop and look at him more carefully. 3 years ago, when Emma had meningitis, there was a doctor at Northwestern Memorial who saved her life, not just medically, but in every way that mattered. She stayed with Emma when her shift ended. She fought the insurance company for better medication, and she never gave up even when Emma's fever wouldn't break. Judge Hoffman leaned forward slightly. "Go on, Mr. Chen." "Today, I found that same doctor in a stalled elevator in premature labor with twins. Her husband was out of the country on business. She was alone and scared. And those babies were coming 6 weeks early whether we were ready or not." Marcus looked directly at Sarah. "So yes, I missed this hearing, because I spent the afternoon helping deliver 2 baby boys who might have died without intervention. Because I chose to be present for someone who needed me, the same way she was present for Emma when we needed her." Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Sarah's expression remained skeptical. "That's a lovely story, Marcus, but it doesn't change the fact that you abandoned your legal obligations today. What happens the next time there's an emergency? What happens when Emma is counting on you and you decide someone else needs you more?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and Janet started to speak, but he held up a hand to stop her. "Sarah," he said, his voice steady and clear, "do you remember the night Emma got sick? Do you remember how terrified I was, how I called you, crying from the hospital because I was convinced I'd failed her as a father?" Sarah's face softened slightly. "Of course I remember. Do you remember what you said to me?" Sarah was quiet, but Marcus could see in her eyes that she remembered perfectly. "You told me that being a good parent meant showing up, especially when it was hard. You said that Emma needed to see that her father was someone who helped people, someone who did the right thing even when it was difficult." Marcus leaned forward. "Today, I showed up for someone who needed help. I did the right thing even though it was difficult. And yes, it cost me this hearing, but it taught me something important about the kind of father I want Emma to see when she looks at me." Judge Hoffman was watching this exchange with interest, her pen poised over her legal pad. "Mr. Chen, can you verify this medical emergency you're describing?" "Yes, Your Honor." Marcus pulled out his phone and showed her photos he'd taken. "In the hospital, with Elizabeth's permission. Dr. Elizabeth Reeves, Northwestern Memorial Emergency Department. Alexander and Benjamin Reeves, Born at approximately 2:47 and 3:15 p.m. today in elevator number 4 of the Meridian Tower downtown. I can provide contact information for the attending physicians, the emergency response team, and several witnesses. Miranda Walsh looked less confident than she had moments before. Your Honor, even if Mr. Chen's story is accurate, it doesn't address the underlying pattern of behavior. What pattern? Marcus interrupted, his voice rising slightly. Missing one hearing to deliver premature twins? Or the pattern of never missing a scheduled visit with Emma in over a year? The pattern of working 2 jobs to make sure my child support is never late? The pattern of moving to a better school district so Emma can stay at the same school? The pattern of going to therapy every week to deal with my anxiety so I can be a better father? He stood up, surprising everyone in the room. You want to talk about patterns? Let's talk about the pattern of me being the parent who shows up to every soccer game, every school play, every parent-teacher conference. Let's talk about the pattern of Emma calling me when she has nightmares, not because I'm the more convenient parent, but because she trusts me to make her feel safe. Sarah's composure was beginning to crack. Marcus. No, let me finish. Marcus's voice was calm but firm. Today I learned something about myself that I didn't know before. I learned that I'm capable of staying calm in a crisis, of making decisions under pressure, of putting someone else's needs ahead of my own when it really matters. I learned that the kind of father Emma needs isn't someone who never makes mistakes or never has emergencies. She needs someone who shows up when it counts. Someone who helps people who need help. Someone who doesn't run away when things get complicated. He looked directly at Judge Hoffman. Your Honor, I missed today's original hearing because I was helping bring 2 lives into the world. I understand that has legal consequences, and I'm prepared to accept them. But I'm not prepared to apologize for being the kind of person who helps strangers in elevators, because that's exactly the kind of person I want my daughter to grow up to be. The room was silent for a long moment. Judge Hoffman looked down at her notes, then back at Marcus. Mr. Chen, can you provide documentation of this medical emergency within 48 hours? Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Morrison, does your client understand that missing legal proceedings, regardless of the reason, is taken very seriously by this court? Janet nodded. He does, Your Honor. But we would ask that you consider the extraordinary circumstances. Judge Hoffman held up a hand. I'm not finished. She looked at Sarah and Richard. Mrs. Holloway, you've argued that your ex-husband is unreliable and that your daughter would benefit from reduced contact with him. But I'm looking at a man who just demonstrated that he's willing to sacrifice his own interests to help someone in need. I'm looking at someone who stayed calm in a life-threatening emergency and successfully assisted in a complicated medical procedure. She paused, making notes on her pad. These are not the actions of an irresponsible person. These are the actions of someone who possesses exactly the qualities we want children to learn: compassion, courage, selflessness, and the ability to act decisively when others need help. Miranda Walsh opened her mouth to speak, but Judge Hoffman continued. Furthermore, I'm troubled by the underlying assumption in your petition. Mrs. Holloway, you seem to believe that your daughter would be better served by a stepfather who can provide financial advantages rather than a biological father who demonstrates consistent emotional availability and moral character. Sarah's face was flushed now. Your Honor, that's not what we're arguing, isn't it? Judge Hoffman's voice was sharp. Because from where I sit, it sounds like you're asking me to reduce a child's contact with her father because he doesn't make enough money to compete with your new husband's lifestyle, and because he had the audacity to help save 2 lives instead of sitting in a conference room arguing about custody percentages. Richard leaned over to whisper something to Miranda Walsh, but Judge Hoffman had clearly made up her mind. Here's my ruling, she said, her voice carrying the weight of final authority. Current custody arrangements will remain in place, Mr. Chen will continue to have Emma every other weekend and 2 evenings per week, plus extended time during school holidays. Additionally, I'm ordering both parents to attend co-parenting counseling to address the communication issues that seem to be at the root of this dispute. She looked directly at Sarah. Mrs. Holloway, your daughter has a father who loves her enough to work multiple jobs to support her, who seeks professional help to address his personal challenges, and who demonstrates the kind of moral character that makes heroes out of ordinary people. I suggest you consider whether trying to limit her access to that kind of role model is really in her best interests. Marcus felt his knees go weak with relief. Janet squeezed his arm, grinning broadly, well across the table. Sarah looked stunned, and Richard appeared to be calculating the cost of their failed legal gambit. Judge Hoffman stood up, signaling the end of the session. Mr. Chen, I expect that documentation of today's emergency within 48 hours. And I hope you'll consider sharing this experience with your daughter when the time is appropriate. She should know that her father is capable of extraordinary things when ordinary people need help. As the room emptied, Sarah approached Marcus hesitantly. For the first time since their divorce, she looked uncertain rather than angry. Marcus, she said quietly, did you really deliver twins in an elevator today? Marcus nodded. 2 healthy boys. They're in the NICU at Northwestern Memorial right now, probably wondering where their elevator guardian angel went. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. I'm sorry, she said finally, for doubting you, for bringing you here today, for making this harder than it needed to be. Sarah, Marcus said gently, we both want what's best for Emma. We just have different ideas about what that looks like sometimes. She nodded, tears forming in her eyes. Maybe the therapy Judge Hoffman ordered isn't such a bad idea. Maybe we need to figure out how to do this better for Emma's sake. Marcus smiled. I'd like that. As Sarah and Richard left the conference room, Marcus felt his phone buzzing. A text from Dr. Kim. Alexander is off the ventilator and breathing on his own. Benjamin is showing improvement. Their mother has been asking about you. Thought you'd want to know. Marcus showed the message to Janet, who was packing up her briefcase with evident satisfaction. So, she said with a grin, how does it feel to win a custody case by delivering babies? Marcus laughed, feeling lighter than he had in months. Like, maybe I'm finally figuring out who I'm supposed to be. And who's that? Marcus thought about Elizabeth, alone in her hospital room, about Alexander and Benjamin fighting to grow strong in their incubators, about Emma probably doing homework. At Sarah's house, about the elevator where his life had changed in the space of a few hours. Someone who shows up, he said simply. Someone who helps. Someone who doesn't run away when things get complicated. Janet smiled. Sounds like exactly the kind of father Emma deserves. As Marcus left the law office and headed back toward Northwestern Memorial Hospital, he realized that the day that had started as his worst nightmare had somehow become one of the most important of his life. He'd missed a custody hearing to deliver premature twins, and in doing so, he discovered exactly the kind of man and father he was capable of being. The evening Chicago skyline stretched out before him as his taxi navigated through downtown traffic, and Marcus found himself thinking not about what he'd almost lost today, but about what he'd gained, the knowledge that when crisis called, he was someone who answered. That when strangers needed help, he was someone who stayed. That when the stakes were highest, he was someone who could be counted on to do the right thing, even when it cost him something precious. Emma would be proud of him when she heard the story. And someday, when Alexander and Benjamin Reeves were old enough to understand, they would know that their first breath of life outside the womb was caught by gentle hands belonging to a man who believed that showing up for people in need was the most important thing anyone could do. 6 months had passed since the elevator delivery that changed Marcus Chen's life forever, and Northwestern Memorial's NICU had become as familiar to him as his own apartment. He knew every nurse by name, understood which monitors meant good news and which ones demanded immediate attention, and could navigate the maze of hospital hallways with the confidence of someone who belonged there. This Friday evening found him in his usual spot by the viewing window, watching Alexander and Benjamin Reeves as they reached yet another milestone in their journey toward home. Both boys had graduated from their incubators weeks ago and were now in open cribs, breathing completely on their own, their tiny bodies having grown strong enough to regulate their own temperature. Alexander, the firstborn, had always been the more aggressive eater and now weighed just over 7 pounds. Benjamin, quieter and more contemplative even as an infant, had reached 6.5 pounds the day before. Dr. Kim had mentioned that morning that they were approaching discharge weight and could potentially go home within the next 2 weeks. Marcus smiled as he watched Benjamin's tiny fist wave in the air, a gesture that had become his signature move whenever he was awake and alert. The boys had developed distinct personalities over the months, and Marcus had been there to witness every small triumph, every setback, every precious moment of growth that marked their progression from fragile preemies to healthy, thriving infants. "They know you're here," came a familiar voice behind him. Marcus turned to find Elizabeth approaching, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the hospital cafeteria. She looked different than she had 6 months ago, not just because she'd recovered from childbirth, but because she carried herself with a new kind of confidence, the assurance of a woman who had survived crisis and emerged stronger on the other side. "How can you tell?" Marcus asked, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Watch Benjamin's eyes," Elizabeth said, moving to stand beside him at the window. "He always looks toward the door when you arrive. The nurses say he's been fussier than usual today, like he's been waiting for something." Marcus studied the infant's face and realized Elizabeth was right. Benjamin's dark eyes seemed to track toward the viewing window, as if he could sense their presence beyond the glass. "That's impossible," Marcus said, though he was smiling. "Babies that young don't have that kind of recognition, do they?" Elizabeth laughed softly. "Medically speaking, you're probably right. But these aren't ordinary circumstances, and these aren't ordinary babies. They spent their first moments in this world being held by you, hearing your voice, feeling your hands keeping them safe. That creates a bond that goes deeper than typical medical understanding." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the boys sleep peacefully in their cribs. It had taken time for Marcus and Elizabeth to develop this easy friendship, built on the foundation of shared crisis, but deepened through months of mutual support during the long NICU journey. Elizabeth's husband David had returned from London 3 days after the birth, full of apologies and explanations that rang hollow against the reality of his absence during the most important moment of his sons' lives. The marriage had ended. Officially 2 months later, when Elizabeth filed for divorce after discovering David had been having an affair with a colleague during his frequent business trips. Marcus had been there through all of it, not as anything more than a friend who understood the pain of watching a family fall apart, but his presence had meant everything to Elizabeth during those dark weeks of legal proceedings and custody negotiations. Unlike Marcus's contentious divorce, Elizabeth's had been swift and relatively clean. David, perhaps feeling guilty about his absence during the birth and his infidelity, had agreed to generous child support payments and limited visitation rights, seeming more relieved than heartbroken to escape the responsibilities of fatherhood. "How's Emma adjusting to all this?" Elizabeth asked, breaking into Marcus's thoughts. Marcus's smile widened. "She's incredible. At first she was a little confused about why Daddy was spending so much time at the hospital with babies who weren't related to us. But once I explained the whole story, she became completely invested in their recovery. She's been drawing them pictures every week and insisting I bring them to hang above their cribs." Elizabeth turned to look at him with genuine warmth. "She's lucky to have you as a father, Marcus. The way you've balanced being there for us while still prioritizing your relationship with her. It's remarkable. The co-parenting therapy ordered by Judge Hoffman had worked better than either Marcus or Sarah had expected. With the help of a skilled family counselor, they'd learned to communicate more effectively about Emma's needs and to separate their failed marriage from their ongoing responsibilities as parents. Sarah had even begun to acknowledge, grudgingly, at first but more genuinely as time passed, that Marcus's actions during the elevator emergency demonstrated exactly the kind of moral character she wanted their daughter to emulate. The breakthrough had come during one particularly emotional therapy session when Emma herself had been invited to participate. She'd listened to her parents discuss the custody dispute, then announced with 8-year-old directness that she was proud of her daddy for helping the baby doctor and that she wanted to meet the twins he'd helped save. Sarah had broken down crying, finally understanding that her attempts to protect Emma from Marcus's perceived failures had actually been depriving their daughter of a relationship with a father who embodied the values they both wanted to instill. "Speaking of Emma," Marcus said, checking his watch, "she should be here any minute. Sarah's bringing her by for her weekly visit with the boys." This had become a Friday evening tradition over the past month, after the NICU staff had agreed to allow Emma to visit as part of the boys' extended support network. Emma took her role as honorary big sister very seriously, always arriving with new artwork or books to read to Alexander and Benjamin, treating them with the gentle reverence of someone who understood they were special. As if summoned by their conversation, Emma appeared at the end of the hallway, her backpack bouncing as she hurried toward them with Sarah following at a more measured pace. Emma had grown taller over the past 6 months, her blonde hair now reaching past her shoulders, but her eyes still held the same bright curiosity that had charmed nurses and doctors during her own hospitalization years earlier. "Daddy!" Emma called out, launching herself into Marcus's arms for their traditional greeting hug. "Are Alex and Ben awake? I brought them new pictures, and Mrs. Patterson said I could read them the book I wrote about brave babies." "They're awake and waiting for you, sweetheart," Marcus said, lifting her up so she could see through the viewing window. "Look, Benjamin is waving at you." Emma pressed her face against the glass, her breath fogging the surface as she peered intently at the infants. "He really is waving. Alex is sleeping, but Ben is definitely saying hello to me." Sarah approached more cautiously, still somewhat uncomfortable in the hospital setting, but making an effort for Emma's sake. Over the months, she'd developed a grudging respect for Elizabeth and had even begun to understand why Marcus felt so connected to the boys and their mother. The relationship wasn't romantic, as Sarah had initially feared, but something deeper and more complex, a chosen family bond forged in crisis and strengthened through shared commitment to these children's well-being. "Hello, Elizabeth," Sarah said warmly, having long since abandoned the formal Dr. Reeves she'd used during their first awkward meeting. "How are they doing this week?" "Wonderfully," Elizabeth replied, genuinely pleased to see Sarah. "Doctor, Kim thinks we might be looking at discharge within the next 10 days if they continue gaining weight at this rate." Emma's eyes widened. "They get to go home soon? But what about our Friday visits?" Elizabeth knelt down to Emma's eye level, her expression serious but kind. "Well, that's something we need to talk about. When the boys come home, they won't need to stay in the hospital anymore, but that doesn't mean we stop being friends. It just means our friendship moves to a different place." "What do you mean?" Emma asked, her 8-year-old mind trying to process the implications. Marcus exchanged a look with Elizabeth, then crouched beside his daughter. "Emma, remember how I told you that sometimes adults make decisions that change everyone's lives in unexpected ways?" Emma nodded solemnly. "Well, Elizabeth and I have been talking, and we think it might be good for everyone if we all spent time together outside the hospital too. Not just as friends who met during an emergency, but as a kind of chosen family." Emma's face lit up with understanding and excitement. Like how Grandma Pat isn't really my grandma, but she's family because she's been Mommy's friend. Forever? Exactly like that, Sarah said, surprising everyone with her immediate support of the idea. Sometimes the most important family relationships are the ones we choose, not the ones we're born with. Over the months, Sarah had watched Marcus's relationship with Elizabeth and the boys evolve, and she'd come to realize that what they'd built together wasn't a threat to Emma's relationship with her father, but rather an expansion of the love and support available to their daughter. Emma had gained 2 honorary baby brothers and a second mother figure who happened to be a brilliant physician, while Marcus had found a sense of purpose and belonging that had been missing since their divorce. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Kim, who approached their group with a broad smile and a clipboard full of discharge paperwork. "Perfect timing," Dr. Kim announced. "I have some news that I think you'll all want to hear." Everyone turned their attention to her expectantly. Alexander and Benjamin have reached all their discharge milestones as of this afternoon's weigh-in. They're both over 7 pounds, they're feeding well, their breathing is completely stable, and all their reflexes are normal. If you're ready. Elizabeth, they can go home this weekend. Elizabeth's hands flew to her mouth, tears immediately springing to her eyes. After 6 months of daily hospital visits, of pumping breast milk and storing it in the NICU freezer, of celebrating ounces of weight gain and worrying over every slight temperature fluctuation, her sons were finally healthy enough to leave this place and begin their real lives. Marcus felt his own throat tighten with emotion. These boys had been the focal point of his life for half a year, and while he was thrilled they were healthy enough for discharge, he also felt a sense of loss at the thought of this chapter ending. Emma, however, had no such mixed feelings. She clapped her hands together and did a little dance right there in the hospital hallway. They get to go home. They get to see their room and sleep in real beds and meet your cat. Elizabeth laughed through her tears. "That's right, sweetheart. They finally get to meet Whiskers." Dr. Kim continued with the practical details of discharge planning, explaining the follow-up appointments that would be needed, the medications that might be required, and the warning signs that should prompt an immediate return to the hospital. Marcus listened intently, already planning how he could rearrange his work schedule to help with the transition during the first critical weeks at home. "There's one more thing," Dr. Kim added, looking specifically at Marcus. "Elizabeth has listed you as an emergency contact and alternate caregiver for the boys. That's fairly unusual for someone who isn't a family member, but given your unique relationship and your demonstrated competence during their delivery, the hospital administration has approved the arrangement." Marcus looked at Elizabeth in surprise. They'd discussed his continued involvement in the boys' lives, but he hadn't expected anything so official. "I should have asked you first," Elizabeth said quickly, reading his expression. "But Marcus, you've been here for every important moment of their lives since birth. You know their routines, their personalities, their medical history. If something happened to me, there's no one I'd trust more to advocate for them and make sure they got the care they needed." Sarah stepped forward, placing a supportive hand on Marcus's shoulder. "I think it's wonderful," she said firmly. "Emma, how do you feel about Daddy being officially listed as Alex and Ben's emergency guardian?" Emma considered this with the seriousness she applied to all important decisions. "Does that mean I'm like their emergency big sister?" "I think that's exactly what it means," Elizabeth said, smiling at Emma's logical conclusion. As they discussed the practical aspects of bringing the boys home, Marcus found himself marveling at how completely his life had transformed since that November day in the elevator. The panicked, anxiety-ridden man who had rushed to a custody hearing convinced he was failing as a father had evolved into someone who was trusted by medical professionals, relied upon by a friend in need, and respected by his ex-wife and daughter for his character and commitment. The changes went beyond just his relationship with Elizabeth and the twins. Marcus's anxiety had improved dramatically through therapy, and through the confidence that came from knowing he could handle genuine emergencies with competence and grace. His relationship with Emma had deepened as she'd watched him demonstrate the values he'd always tried to teach her through words alone. Even his work had improved, as his reputation as someone who stayed calm under pressure and could be counted on in a crisis had led to a promotion to senior foreman and a significant salary increase. "There's something else we need to discuss," Elizabeth said as Dr. Kim finished her discharge instructions and headed back to her rounds. "About living arrangements." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. They'd talked generally about the future, about how their unconventional family structure might work once the boys were discharged, but they'd avoided making any definitive plans. "The apartment I'm renting is fine for now," Elizabeth continued, "but it's not ideal for twins who are going to be very active very soon. And honestly, trying to manage 2 babies alone while working full-time at the hospital, it's going to be challenging." Sarah and Emma listened with obvious interest, both of them having become invested in Elizabeth and the boys' well-being over the months. "What are you thinking?" Marcus asked gently. Elizabeth took a deep breath. "There's a house for rent in Riverside, about 10 minutes from here. 4 bedrooms, big yard, quiet neighborhood with good schools. It's more space than I need alone, but it would be perfect for a non-traditional family arrangement." Marcus stared at her, understanding the implications, but not quite ready to believe what she seemed to be suggesting. "You mean?" he started. "I mean that Emma could have her own room for when she stays with you. Alexander and Benjamin could each have their own space as they get older, and we could share the responsibilities of raising 3 children while still maintaining our independence and our friendship." Emma's eyes had grown wide as she followed the conversation. "Daddy, does that mean we could live with Elizabeth and the babies?" "Not all the time, sweetheart," Marcus explained carefully. "You'd still spend most of your time with Mommy and Richard, but when you're with me, we'd all be together in the same house." Sarah surprised everyone by speaking up immediately. "I think it's a brilliant idea." Everyone turned to look at her, and she smiled at their shocked expressions. "Emma thrives when she's around the boys," Sarah continued. "She's more confident, more nurturing, more excited about everything when she's been here for her Friday visits. And Marcus, you've never been happier or more centered than you have been these past 6 months. If this arrangement gives Emma access to that kind of positive environment, while still maintaining our custody schedule, I'm completely supportive." Elizabeth looked relieved and grateful. "Are you sure, Sarah? It's a big change, and I know. It affects your family, too." "It affects my daughter positively," Sarah said firmly. "That's all that matters to me. Besides," she added with a grin, "having a pediatric emergency room physician as part of Emma's extended support network doesn't exactly worry me from a safety perspective." Marcus felt overwhelmed by the generosity and trust being shown by both women and by the magnitude of the decision they were all making together. 6 months ago, he'd been a divorced single father struggling to maintain meaningful contact with his daughter. Now he was being invited to help raise 3 children in a chosen family structure that defied conventional categories but felt more right than anything he'd ever experienced. "There's one condition," he said finally, looking directly at Elizabeth. Her face showed a flicker of concern. "What's that?" "I pay my fair share of everything. Rent, utilities, groceries, childcare, medical expenses. This isn't charity, and I'm not a guest. If we're doing this, we're doing it as equal partners." Elizabeth smiled with obvious relief. "I was hoping you'd say that." Emma had been listening to this entire conversation with the intense focus she applied to anything that directly affected her world. Now she tugged on Marcus's sleeve to get his attention. "Daddy," she said seriously, "does this mean Alex and Ben are going to be my real brothers?" Marcus knelt down to her eye level, considering his words carefully. "They're going to be your brothers in every way that matters, sweetheart. Not because we share the same mommy and daddy, but because we choose to be family and we take care of each other. Emma nodded as if this made perfect sense to her 8-year-old logic. Good, she said with satisfaction. I've been practicing being a big sister, and I think I'm getting pretty good at it. As they made plans for the boys' discharge and the logistics of moving into their new shared living arrangement, Marcus reflected on the strange journey that had brought them all to this point. A stalled elevator had changed the trajectory of multiple lives, creating connections that wouldn't have existed otherwise and revealing strengths that might never have been discovered. Alexander and Benjamin would grow up knowing that their first breath outside the womb had been caught by gentle hands belonging to a man who chose to help rather than walk away. Emma would grow up understanding that family was about commitment and choice as much as biology. Elizabeth would know that she didn't have to navigate single motherhood alone, that there were people willing to share the joys and responsibilities of raising her children. And Marcus had learned that being a good father meant more than just providing financial support or showing up for scheduled visits. It meant being the kind of person who helped strangers in elevators, who stayed calm in emergencies, who built relationships based on mutual respect and shared values rather than legal obligations or social expectations. 3 weeks later, on a sunny Saturday morning in early spring, Marcus stood in the backyard of their rental house in Riverside, watching Emma push a stroller containing both Alexander and Benjamin around the garden path they'd created together. The boys were awake and alert, their dark eyes tracking the movement of leaves overhead, their tiny hands grasping at the mobile Elizabeth had attached to the stroller handle. Elizabeth emerged from the house carrying a picnic blanket and a basket of lunch supplies, her face relaxed and happy in a way Marcus had never seen during their months in the hospital. She was wearing jeans and a casual sweater, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, looking more like a suburban mom than the accomplished emergency room physician she remained during her work shifts. Perfect day for the boys' first real outdoor adventure, she said, spreading the blanket on the grass in the shade of an old oak tree. They seemed to love it, Marcus observed, watching Benjamin's face scrunch up in what might have been a smile at the sensation of sunshine and fresh air. Emma carefully maneuvered the stroller over to the blanket and began the process of lifting first Alexander, then Benjamin, settling them on the soft surface where they could look up at the tree branches swaying overhead. At almost 9 months old now, adjusted for their premature birth, they were beginning to show real personality and responsiveness to the people around them. "Daddy, look," Emma called excitedly. "Alex is trying to grab my finger." Marcus joined them on the blanket, marveling as always at the perfect tiny features that had been so frightening in their premature fragility, but were now simply beautiful in their healthy development. Alexander's grip on Emma's finger was strong and determined, while Benjamin seemed more interested in the patterns of light and shadow created by the tree branches above. "They're going to be completely different people," Elizabeth observed, settling beside them with obvious contentment. "Alex is going to be the one who climbs trees and rides his bike too fast. Ben is going to be the one who notices everything and asks questions about how things work." "Like Emma," Marcus said, smiling at his daughter. "She's always been the observer, the one who sees details other people miss." Emma beamed at the comparison, clearly pleased to be seen as someone who shared Benjamin's contemplative nature. Over the months, she developed a special connection with the quieter twin, while Alexander seemed drawn to her energy and animation. As they settled into their picnic lunch, Marcus's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it and smiled, then showed it to Elizabeth. It was from Dr. Kim, saw the boys' 6-month follow-up results. Perfect development scores across the board. You should all be very proud. Hope you're enjoying your adventure in suburbia. Elizabeth laughed. Dr. Kim has been texting me pictures of the NICU babies who remind her of Alex and Ben, I think. She misses having them around. The whole staff misses them, Marcus said. And us. Nurse Patricia told me last week that the NICU feels too quiet on Friday evenings now. They'd maintained their connections to the hospital community that had supported them through the critical early months, but those relationships had evolved from medical necessity to genuine friendship. Several of the NICU nurses had visited the house since the boys' discharge, marveling at how the tiny, fragile infants they'd cared for had transformed into healthy, thriving babies ready to explore the world. As the afternoon sun began to shift lower in the sky, casting longer shadows across their yard, Marcus found himself thinking about the larger implications of the choices they'd all made. Their arrangement was unconventional, certainly, but it was working beautifully. Emma split her time between two homes but felt secure and loved in both. Elizabeth had the support she needed to balance her demanding career with motherhood. The twins were surrounded by people who were committed to their well-being and development. Most importantly, none of them felt like they were settling for second best or making do with an imperfect situation. They were building something intentional and meaningful, something that honored the connections forged in crisis while creating space for growth and change as their family continued to evolve. "Daddy," Emma said, interrupting his reflections, "when Alex and Ben get older, are you going to tell them the story about how you caught them when they were born?" Marcus looked at the two boys, now drowsy from their afternoon in the fresh air, and felt the familiar sense of wonder at having been present for their first moments in the world. "I think that's a story they should hear many times as they grow up," he said. "But not just the dramatic part about the elevator and the emergency. The whole story about how sometimes strangers become family and how helping people when they need it most is one of the most important things we can do." Elizabeth reached over and squeezed his hand. "It's a good story," she said softly. "One of the best I know." As they packed up their picnic and prepared to head inside for the boys' evening routine, Marcus realized that the story was still being written. The elevator delivery had been the dramatic beginning, but everything since then, all the small daily choices to show up for each other, to build something meaningful together, to create a safe and loving environment for three children to grow up in, that was the real story worth telling. The sun set over their suburban neighborhood, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reflected off the windows of the house they now called home. Inside, Alexander and Benjamin would soon settle into their cribs for the night, surrounded by the artwork Emma had created for them, watched over by the people who had chosen to become their family. And Marcus Chen, the man who had once believed he was failing as a father, would tuck his daughter into her bed in the room next to theirs, knowing that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to demonstrate the values that mattered most: showing up, helping others, and choosing love over fear whenever the choice presented itself. 2 years had transformed everything. Marcus stood in the kitchen of their riverside home, scrambling eggs while Alexander banged a wooden spoon against his high chair, and Benjamin carefully arranged his cereal pieces into perfect rows. At nearly 3 years old, the twins had developed into distinct individuals who bore no resemblance to the fragile infants he'd once caught in his hands during those terrifying moments in the elevator. Alexander had indeed become the daredevil Elizabeth had predicted, constantly climbing furniture and testing the limits of gravity with the fearless enthusiasm of a natural athlete. His dark hair was perpetually tousled from his latest adventure, and he possessed an infectious laugh that could brighten any room. Benjamin, true to his contemplative nature, was methodical in everything he did, preferring puzzles and books to physical challenges, his quiet observations often surprising the adults around him with their insight. Emma, now 10 and officially the best big sister in Chicago according to her own assessment, sat at the kitchen table helping Benjamin with his precise breakfast arrangement while simultaneously reading him a story about dinosaurs. She'd grown into her role as the responsible older sibling with remarkable grace, balancing her time between her mother's house and their unconventional family arrangement with the adaptability that children possess when they feel secure and Loved in both environments. Daddy Marcus, Alexander announced, using the name he'd settled on to distinguish Marcus from the father he saw every other weekend. Today is story day at school. Marcus smiled, flipping the eggs with practiced ease. Over the past 2 years, he'd become surprisingly competent at domestic tasks he'd never imagined himself mastering. What story are you going to tell, buddy? The elevator story. Alexander declared with enthusiasm. About how you caught me and Benny when we were tiny babies. This had become Alexander's favorite tale to share during school show and tell sessions, much to the delight of his classmates and the occasional concern of teachers who weren't quite sure how to fact-check such an extraordinary claim. Marcus and Elizabeth had learned to provide documentation for skeptical educators, complete with hospital records and newspaper clippings from the local reporter who had eventually picked up their story. Elizabeth emerged from the hallway, dressed in her scrubs and ready for her shift at Northwestern Memorial. She'd been promoted to Assistant Chief of Emergency Medicine the previous year, a recognition of both her medical skills and her ability to remain calm under pressure. The elevator experience had somehow enhanced rather than diminished her professional confidence, as if proving to herself that she could handle any crisis life presented. Morning chaos level seems manageable today, she observed, kissing the top of each twin's head before pouring herself coffee. Alexander, remember that when you tell the elevator story at school, you need to mention that babies should only be delivered by doctors in hospitals, not in elevators by construction foremen. Marcus laughed. Even very handsome and capable. Construction foreman, he added, earning himself a playful swat from Elizabeth. Even those, she confirmed with a smile that still made Marcus's heart skip occasionally, though their relationship remained carefully platonic. They'd discovered over the months that their connection was deeper and more sustainable as chosen family than it might have been as romantic partners, and both were content with the arrangement that gave their children stability without the complications of navigating adult relationship dynamics. Benjamin looked up from his perfectly organized cereal. Mama Elizabeth, will you be home for dinner? I'll be home by 6, Elizabeth promised, her voice carrying the same gentle authority she used with frightened patients in the emergency room. And Uncle Marcus is making his famous spaghetti and meatballs, so we'll have a proper feast. The designation of Uncle Marcus had evolved naturally as the boys learned to speak, their way of acknowledging his central role in their lives while recognizing that Elizabeth was their primary parent. Similarly, they called Emma Sister Emma, with the solemnity of children who understood that family relationships could be chosen as well as inherited. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from his current job site. As senior foreman for Hartwell Construction, he now had the flexibility to adjust his schedule around the family's needs, a luxury that would have been impossible during his desperate early days as a divorced father. The promotion and salary increase that had followed his reputation for crisis management had fundamentally altered his financial situation, allowing him to contribute equally to household expenses and provide for Emma's needs without the constant stress that had once characterized his daily existence. I need to check on the Morrison project this morning, Marcus announced, but I'll be back by 3 to pick up Emma from school. This had become their routine. Elizabeth worked her hospital shifts while Marcus managed his construction responsibilities, and they tag-teamed childcare duties with the efficiency of partners who'd learned to trust each other completely. Emma's school pickup was one of Marcus's favorite responsibilities, a chance to hear about her day and see his daughter's face light up at the prospect of spending time with her chosen brothers. Sarah had remarried Richard the previous summer, in a ceremony that Emma had helped plan, wearing a flower girl dress she'd picked out specifically because it matches the color of Alexander's favorite truck. The relationship between Marcus and Sarah had evolved into something approaching genuine friendship, built on mutual respect and shared commitment to Emma's well-being. Richard, to his credit, had never tried to replace Marcus as Emma's father, instead embracing his role as a supportive stepfather who could provide different strengths to their daughter's life. "Daddy Marcus," Benjamin said quietly, using his characteristic serious tone. "Are you going to build more houses today?" "I'm going to check on a house that other people are building," Marcus explained patiently. Benjamin was fascinated by construction processes and could spend hours watching Marcus review blueprints or examine building materials. "Would you like to come with me after lunch? We could look at the framing together." Benjamin's face lit up with the kind of pure joy that reminded Marcus why he'd fallen in love with this role of chosen father to boys who weren't biologically his but felt completely like his own children. Alexander, not to be outdone, banged his spoon more enthusiastically. "I want to see the big trucks." "The big trucks are at a different job site," Marcus said diplomatically, "but maybe we can drive past them on our way home." As the morning routine continued around him, Marcus found himself reflecting on the unpredictable path that had led to this moment. The custody hearing he'd missed 2 years ago had seemed like the end of the world at the time, but it had actually marked the beginning of a life richer and more meaningful than anything he'd previously imagined possible. Emma had thrived in their expanded family structure, developing confidence and leadership skills through her role as big sister while maintaining her close relationship with both her biological parents. The boys were healthy, happy, and surrounded by people who were committed to their growth and development. Elizabeth had found the support system she needed to balance her demanding career with motherhood, while Marcus had discovered a sense of purpose and belonging that had been missing since his divorce. The doorbell rang, interrupting his musings. Elizabeth opened it to reveal Dr. Kim, now retired from her position as head of neonatology, but still a regular visitor who treated Alexander and Benjamin like honorary grandchildren. "Perfect timing," Dr. Kim announced, producing a wrapped package from behind her back. "I brought something for the boys." Alexander and Benjamin abandoned their breakfast to crowd around her, their faces bright with anticipation. Dr. Kim had become a beloved figure in their household, the medical professional who had overseen their critical early development, but also the honorary grandmother who never forgot birthdays or missed opportunities to celebrate their milestones. "What is it, Dr. Kim?" Emma asked, her own curiosity piqued by the mysterious package. Dr. Kim smiled mysteriously. "It's something I've been working on for a while. A special project about 2 very special boys and the day they decided to be born in an elevator." She unwrapped the package to reveal a beautifully illustrated children's book titled The Elevator Babies. The cover showed a cartoon elevator with 2 tiny infants being gently held by a figure who looked remarkably like Marcus, while a woman who resembled Elizabeth smiled from a hospital bed. "You wrote a book about us?" Alexander asked with wonder. "I wrote a book about courage," Dr. Kim corrected gently. "About how ordinary people can do extraordinary things when someone needs help. About how babies who are born in unusual places can grow up to be strong and healthy and loved." Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion as he looked through the pages of the book, which told their story with gentle humor and child-appropriate language. The illustrations captured the essence of that day without frightening young readers, focusing on the love and care that had surrounded the twins from their first moments in the world. "This is incredible," Elizabeth said, her own voice thick with gratitude. "The boys will treasure this forever." "It's not just for them, Dr. Kim explained. "I'm donating copies to hospital waiting rooms and pediatric clinics across the city. Sometimes families going through medical crises need to hear stories about how things can turn out well, about how strangers can become heroes, about how love shows up in unexpected ways." Benjamin had settled onto the floor with the book, carefully turning each page and studying the illustrations with his characteristic attention to detail. "Look, Alexander," he said seriously. "This is us when we were tiny." Alexander peered over his brother's shoulder, then looked up at Marcus with pure adoration. "You really did catch us, didn't you, Daddy Marcus?" "I really did," Marcus confirmed, kneeling down beside them. "And it was the most important thing I've ever done." As Dr. Kim stayed for coffee and the twins became absorbed in their book, Marcus stepped outside onto the back porch to call Janet Morrison, his former attorney who had become a friend over the years since the custody case was resolved. "Janet," he said when she answered, "you're never going to believe what just happened." He told her about the book, about Dr. Kim's project to share their story with other families facing medical challenges. As he spoke, Marcus realized that their experience had rippled far beyond their own lives, touching people they'd never met, providing hope to families navigating their own crises. "Marcus," Janet said when he finished, "do you realize what you've become?" "What do you mean?" "You've become the person you were always meant to be. The man who missed a custody hearing to deliver babies in an elevator, who chose to help a stranger instead of protecting his own interests, who built a family based on love rather than biology. You've become living proof that heroism isn't about grand gestures, it's about showing up when people need you." Marcus watched through the kitchen window as Emma read the elevator book aloud to Alexander and Benjamin, their faces rapt with attention as she brought their origin story to life with theatrical flair. Elizabeth sat beside them, her scrubs forgotten for the moment as she became absorbed in their family mythology being transformed into something larger than themselves. "Janet," Marcus said quietly, "I never thanked you properly for what you did during the custody hearing. For understanding why I had to miss it, for defending my choices even when they seemed crazy." "Marcus," Janet replied firmly, "you don't thank someone for recognizing heroism when they see it. You just keep being the person who makes that recognition possible." After ending the call, Marcus remained on the porch for a few more minutes, watching his chosen family through the window, and marveling at the way crisis had transformed into blessing. The elevator that had trapped him and Elizabeth for those crucial hours had actually freed them both from lives that weren't quite right, launching them towards something better than either could have imagined alone. Alexander's laughter carried through the glass as Emma reached the part of the story where he emerged into the world, followed immediately by Benjamin's quieter but equally delighted giggle. Elizabeth looked up and caught Marcus's eye through the window, sharing a smile that encompassed everything they'd built together: the trust, the partnership, the commitment to raising 3 children who would grow up knowing that family was about choice and love rather than obligation and biology. Marcus Chen, the man who had once believed he was failing as a father, had become the cornerstone of a family structure that defied conventional categories but worked beautifully for everyone it encompassed. The boys who had entered the world through his gentle hands were thriving under the care of parents who had chosen each other not for romance but for the deeper commitment of shared values and mutual support. Emma was growing into a confident, compassionate young woman who understood that helping others was the most important thing anyone could do. As Marcus opened the door to rejoin his family, he carried with him the quiet satisfaction of a life lived with purpose. The elevator story would continue to be told in Dr. Kim's book and in Alexander's show and tell presentations and in the conversations of families who needed to believe that strangers could become angels when circumstances demanded it. But the real story, Marcus knew, was happening right here in this kitchen, in these daily moments of ordinary love and extraordinary commitment, in the choice all of them made every day to show up for each other, no matter what challenges arose. That was the story worth living, the one that transformed crisis into blessing, and proved that heroism was less about dramatic rescues and more about the steady, consistent decision to be present when people needed you most. The elevator had been just the beginning. Everything that came after, everything they had built together, that was the real miracle. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.